In my last video, I talked a little bit about the history between the Qing dynasty and Korea and how that an accident in history led it to be that a symbol of Korea's nationalism, Mount Baktu and Tianchi Lake, turned it out to be almost wholly within Chinese territory. We're going to continue that and bring it into modern day with the relations between the DPRK and the PRC. It eventually became a real sore point that the whole mountain and the surrounding land actually turned out not to be in Korea at all. The DPRK pushed the Chinese to address this humiliation, and eventually they would eventually get them to the negotiation table, and we're going to talk about more of that just now. So this is the time that China decided to give up its sacred land. The DPRK and the PRC shared communist sympathies and were allies, but China is not in the business of ceding territory. Think back to Hong Kong, Macau, and the foreign concessions during the century of humiliation. China had all of Changbaishan, even has governments passed from the Qing to the ROC and now the Communist Party. Why give it up now? So for the first decade of the PRC's existence, the situation continued as before, with the Chinese doing nothing. China had other fish to fry. They had to deal with the Sino-Indian border, the Korean War, and the turmoil stemming from Mao's Great Leap Forward. So who cares about this mountain? But the DPRK insisted even as China dawdled. They needed some way to force the Chinese to the bargaining table. Thus, as it, and Communist China itself likes to do when things aren't going its way, North Korea began to undertake influence operations under the table. In spring 1961, Chinese officials began to notice a large number of North Korean immigrants illegally crossing the border into China and settling there. Rampant illegal immigration potentially invites a challenge to China's claim on the territory. You would only need to look at the Russian annexation of the Crimea as an example of this tactic in action. You populate a region with people of your ethnicity and use that as a leverage point for annexation. But rather than aggressively pressing the matter to enforce border security, the Chinese Central Ministry of Foreign Affairs strangely backed off. The order to the Chinese ambassador to North Korea at the time noted that we will not resort to diplomatic channels. Recently, the Sino-North Korean relationship has been in very good shape. Don't overreact, to Korean nationals illegally crossing the border. North Korea had gotten what it would eventually want, though. The Chinese decided to come to the negotiation table. On March 30th, 1962, Premier Zhou Enlai called a meeting of cadres to discuss the matter of the Sino-Korean border. They planned out general strategy on how they would approach the forthcoming talks with North Korea. There's very little public information available about their goals, strategies, and thinking, but we can make a few guesses. 1962 found China in a bit of a weakened state. The country was in the midst of emerging from the Great Leap Forward and 4 years away from descending into the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. Internally, there were plenty of fires to put out. More importantly, there was external strife on the horizon with the Sino-Soviet split. The split is one of the most consequential geopolitical events in the past half-century. As it turns out, almost as large as the Cold War itself. Beginning of differences of opinion between Mao and Nikita Khrushchev about the next step of the Communist Revolution, it would set China and the Soviet Union at odds with each other and into a scramble for allies. It would bring China and the United States together, and it would cause the Chinese to invade Vietnam. North Korea was a plum potential ally. The party was ready to make concessions to lure them away from the Soviets for good. But China during this period of time could not match up to the Soviet Union's economic strength. So whatever China would have to offer to the North Koreans could not be financial. It would have to be something else. Thus, China entered these negotiations at a disadvantage, already aware they would have to give up something critical, land rather than cash. North Korea knew the same thing, and they took full advantage. Over the next few days, from April 10th to the 14th, North Korean and Chinese officials met in the Chinese city of Andong, now called Dandong, on the Yalu River for negotiations. Vice Foreign Minister Ji Pengfei headed the Chinese delegation. His North Korean counterpart was Ru Jiangsik. Talks happened, but we have no clue what was said. After about 5 rounds of talks, it seemed like they were at a loggerheads. The two sides had their own version of what they wanted, and they were not getting any closer to a deal. So Chinese ambassador to North Korea, Hao De-qing, proposed a postponement. The Chinese apparently did not feel 100% about the Koreans' proposals. The North Koreans agreed. During the rest period, the Chinese hit the history books. They requested historical documents and materials on the Sino-Korean border out of the archives. Sadly, all materials related to the 1712 negotiations between the Qing and the Joseon dynasty had long rotted away, and the retreating nationalist government had taken all the papers on the local history of the border with them to Taiwan. On April 19th, the Foreign Affairs Office of the Jiangsu province told the Central Ministry of Foreign Affairs that they could not find any materials on Tianqi and Huangqiaoping, which are on the Sino-North Korean border. We located no materials on the Sino-Korean border. The implication of the inquest is that the North Koreans proposed full ownership of Tianqi, the beautiful heaven lake that sits in the cauldron of the top of Mount Baktu. China's starting position on this, however, was clear. We already have a clear view of Tianqi. Tianqi belongs to China. The North Koreans disagreed. Not having historical documentation to fall back on and unable to access the Wikipedia article at the time, the Chinese delegation found it difficult to negotiate on even grounds with the North Koreans. Tensions began to grow between the two sides. Some calming words needed to be exchanged at a higher level in order to make progress on a potential breakthrough. Thus, 2 weeks later, on April 30th, Deng Xiaoping, then General Secretary of the CCP Central Committee, met with North Korean ambassador to China, Han Ik-soo. Deng told Han that the Chinese had no problem with withdrawing their borders. China only had issue where that border would be ultimately drawn. We hold identical views on this. The remaining issue is how to delimit the boundary line. It is a matter of drawing a boundary line. It is not a big deal. Looking at Deng's words, you can guess that he either thought or had been told that the North Koreans were thinking that perhaps the Chinese were not serious about finding a solution to the Sino-Korean border. There was the potential for talks to spiral out of control, with relations coming away damaged, driving the North Koreans closer to the Soviet Union. Thus, Deng made a point to also say to Han, between fraternal parties, we should not conduct diplomacy. We should maintain a comradely relationship. Deng took the North Korean concerns back to the CCP Central Committee on June 3, 1962. Over the June 1962 period, they came down on the general outline that allowed the Chinese authorities to make concessions on what the North Koreans were demanding. Then, Zhou Enlai met with the North Koreans on June 28 to discuss their suggested solution to the border issue. Thus, a framework emerged for the cessation of Chinese land. On September 15th, Vice Foreign Minister Ryu told Ambassador Hao that the North Koreans agreed to the solution. From there, things developed quickly. The Vice Foreign Minister flew to Pyongyang to turn the general concept into a detailed treaty. On October 3rd, the two sides signed the minutes. Zhou Enlai would then visit Pyongyang 8 days later to meet with Kim Il-sung himself for the final treaty signing. North Korea's Supreme People's Congress approved the final copy of the treaty on November 7th. The Standing Committee of China's National People's Congress, the most powerful people in the country, approved it on November 24th. The final borders were redrawn on March 20th, 1963, and the PLA retreated to them. We actually don't know all that much about the treaty itself. It's a state secret, but we can easily make guesses based on the available evidence. The biggest roadblock for the North Korean demand was for ownership of Heaven Lake, Tianqi, atop Baktu. The treaty addresses this issue by granting partial ownership to the North Koreans, 54.5% to the North Koreans and 45.5% to the Chinese. As Zhou Enlai is quoted to have said to Nixon, we finally solved the question by dividing and sharing the lake. Why keep a 50-year-old treaty a state secret? Mao, Zhou, and the other founders of the Chinese Communist Party knew the sensitivity of what they were doing. They were ceding China's territorial sovereignty to another country. Even if that country was friendly to the Chinese, this could easily be used against you in the future, and really, it sets a bad example. And during the Cultural Revolution, it indeed turned out to be the case. Zhu Dehai, chief administrator of the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture, would be captured and held on trial by Red Guards for his quote-unquote treasonable acts of selling Heaven Lake to the Koreans. He would be later expelled from the party for it. Zhu, however, was a scapegoat. The whole party is to be blamed for the loss of Tianqi. For a short time, it found itself temporarily weak. It faced a savvy diplomat in Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans, and they were short-sighted in the face of the Sino-Soviet split. They caved, and the party today suffers the consequences. After the fall of the Soviet Union, China no longer needed North Korea's political cover. In 1992, South Korea and the People's Republic of China established diplomatic ties, and South Korean tourists were allowed to visit Mount Baktu and Heaven Lake for the first time. And oh boy, did they. 1.4 million tourists visited Mount Baktu in 2011. 80% of them are Korean. As fanatics are wont to do, they got super passionate about it. An example to look for is a reality variety show in 2008. When cast members arrived at Heaven Lake, they got emotional, crying out that Mount Baktu is the spiritual essence of the Korean people. Tourists would collect bottles of water from the lake and pour bottles of water from South Korea into the lake, representing their desire that all waters of Korea would one day be reunited. Considering that this was happening on Chinese territory, this annoyed a lot of people. You will not have to look far into history for similar examples of this happening. Jerusalem's Wailing Wall comes to mind. Perhaps spurred on by these encroachments, a new generation of Chinese nationalists decided to revisit the Mount Baekdu issue. The way they see it, North Korea took advantage of a moment of weakness in China's history to negotiate a massive violation of its territorial sovereignty. This was an accident of history that should never have happened. China began to tighten up with the goal of pushing back on the Koreans' cultural claim on the lake. The name Baekdu is no longer used in China, or Taiwan for that matter. Everyone calls it Changbaishan. Every local school and landmark there got renamed and scrubbed of Korean ancestry. If your company puts Baekdu on any sign or advert, you will mysteriously lose your contracts to operate there. The Chinese at the same time reasserted Changbaishan as the ancestral home of the Manzhou people long before the Koreans arrived, and they registered the mountain with various international committees as a natural and cultural treasure. The infamous Northeast Asian History Project sought to redefine many aspects of history that have been previously aligned as Korean as Chinese. The ancient kingdom of Goguryeo, probably butchered that, is the most prominent example. And then remember that time Trump met with Xi Jinping in April 2017 about North Korea? Trump said later to the press that Xi told him about the history of China and Korea and how Korea actually used to be part of China. And I quote, he, President Xi, then went into a history of China and Korea. Not North Korea, Korea. And you know, you're talking about thousands of years and many wars. And Korea actually used to be a part of China. A spat rose up for a short while about this, but most Americans moved on, assuming that it was just Trump not hearing things right and saying dumb things. That might be right. He did say a lot of dumb things later on. But if that was the case, then why didn't Xi reply that he had been misquoted? He and the Chinese government actually never publicly corrected Trump's statement. And if he wasn't corrected, then there is a decent chance that Xi actually said it. And that is probably because he likely believes it. To the Chinese Communist Party of today, reclaiming this history helps cement its claim to the land that it once had, but partly ceded to the Koreans. All right, have a good one. Bye-bye.